the chess cards, and the thing is, like, I am somewhat familiar with these cards already. We know they announced their effects like a while ago. What I actually am curious about is that I've heard that there's a decent amount of hype surrounding these cards, which I think is very interesting. So let's see how good exactly these are. So we've got Angeliki Shatranga. Is that the right way to say it? Anyways, level 10 light fairy synchro monster, generic level 10 synchro. You can target one monster your opponent controls, banish it. Unironically, that is already not the worst on a level 10 generic synchro. If this card is placed in the spell trap zone as a continuous spell, you can add an Angeliki trap card from your deck or grave to your hand. Only use each of the preceding effects once per turn. While this card is treated as a continuous spell, your opponent can only attempt to activate up to 5 monster effects per turn. Okay, so this is like, in general, I am a big fan of the Angeliki deck. I think the flavor in this deck is really, really awesome because a lot of the cards work like chess pieces, and I think that's really cool. I think the one thing about this deck that is arguably pretty cringe is the fact that the king is one of the main ways this deck I think is winning the game, is by simply floodgating your opponent into activating only 5 monsters. And 5 monster effects is like in the realm where I am not sure if this is good enough, which would probably make it fine, but it does have some pretty weird implications. Because, like, here's the weird thing. Here's the weird thing with floodgates. The weird thing with floodgates is that they either are too strong and completely broken, or they don't do enough and are way too easy to outplay for your opponent. There's no, I personally don't believe that there's a middle ground for floodgates. There's no floodgate that's okay. There's no floodgate, because if it's not enough, then people just don't play it, or they just out it. If it's too good, then people, like, typically the floodgates that are too good are the ones that are, well, not, they can't play around it. So this one, it just depends on, I think, the decks in the format. Is there a deck in the format that can easily out the king with 5 monster effects? If the answer is yes, then this card is not going to be a problem for them at all. Or if they can't do it, then this card is a huge problem, right? So yeah, I don't know. Most decks' way to out it is SP and lose the battle phase. Well, if that's the core interaction, then it's fine, but also then the deck is probably not good. If every deck can easily make an SP to out this, then it's probably just not that good, right? But yeah. Angeliki Bastion, which is, I think, the Rook. Yeah, that's the Rook. Level 8 Light Fairy Synchro, also generic level 8 Synchro. You can target one other card in this card's column, banish it. Okay, so here's the thing. It's cool. And this is where I appreciate the flavor of these cards, right? Because, like, the king in chess can move any direction, so it can banish any monster on the opponent controls, right? It doesn't matter. The rook does have to go in a straight line, basically, right? The rook can only out a monster in the same column, which I think is kind of cool. If this card is placed in a spell trap zone, you can place the king from your extra deck in your spell trap zone as a phase-up continuous spell. And while this card is treated as a continuous spell, other Angeliki cards on the field cannot be destroyed by your opponent's card effects. So basically, usually you're not going to place the king directly from your extra deck into the spell and trap zone. You're always going to get the king from the rook. So the rook is going to be placed into the spell trap zone from the extra deck usually, and then you're going to get the king, which means, first of all, you're castling, which is cool. Second of all, it does make the king harder to out in certain decks, because your king can now also not be destroyed by card effects. So your floodgate, quote unquote, that limits your opponent to 5 monster effects, is protected by destruction, which makes it more complicated to use. You know, you can't simply use like Fallen and the Virtuous to out it, because the rook is protecting it. And I think that also is in some ways kind of cringe. So yeah. Well, that's why you castle. Yeah, you castle to protect your king, which once again, let me say it again. The flavor of this archetype, I think, is exceptional. I love it for that. As someone, I mean, I'm not that big into chess, but I've played it before. I find it interesting, and I know how it works. So I can appreciate these cards for that. I do think this is really, really cool from that perspective, and really, really awesome. However, at the end of the day, you know, if this ends up being a viable Yu-Gi-Oh deck, you do also have to look at it. Okay, what kind of gameplay does it provide? Because if let me tell you this much: if I'm looking at these cards in theory, I can appreciate all these things. I can like, ooh, the rook places the king and then protects it, like if they're castling, and the removal effects correspond to how they move in the chess game. All that is cool. But then if I sit across from it in a game of Yu-Gi-Oh, and my opponent floodgates me out of the game because my deck doesn't work with less than 5 monster effects, I'm not gonna appreciate that, you know, this is like chess. Like, oh, the way they floodgated me that reminds me of chess. This is cool. No, if I sit across from it and I'm being floodgated and I can't out it because it's protected by card effects and all that, like it's still gonna be bad, right? So you have to evaluate these cards from two different angles. I feel like you have to look at it from the perspective of like, okay, they were designed to work like chess pieces. That's cool. But then you also have to evaluate it from the actual gameplay that they provide. And so far, nothing here is super like awesome in terms of like the actual gameplay. So let's see what else we have. Angeliki Destrier, which I think is the horse or the knight. Level 7 Light Fairy. You can target one monster in another column, banish it. So this one, because the knight can never go in a straight line, you cannot out the monster in the same column. You have to pick a different column, which is kind of like the knight would, how the knight would move. So that part's really cool. If this card is placed in the spell and trap zone as a continuous spell, you can add one Angeliki spell from your deck to your hand. You can only use the preceding effects once per turn. While this card is treated as a continuous spell, each time your opponent activates a card or effect, inflict 500 damage to your opponent when it resolves. Just another one of these, like, so essentially, so far, my feeling for this deck is that whenever these cards are being used as monsters, they're awesome. Like, the way they move or the way they have removal, it reminds me of the game of chess, and all that is cool. What they haven't really nailed yet is the effects as continuous spells. It's like, okay, well, this one's like, kind of like a masquerade type card. This one limits the amount of cards they can use in a turn. And it's like, okay. And like, in general, this is also something I want to get out there. The fact that this chess archetype uses the spell trap zone, I think is freaking awesome. Okay? Like, the fact that these cards use the spell and trap zone because it represents, like, you know, in the beginning of a chess game, you have like 2 rows of chess pieces. You have your back row and you have your front row, I think is really, really cool. But what I don't understand, and I guess this is just some feedback on the design, on like just the practical way these cards work, like why are the cards in the continuous spells, why are they just like floodgatey effects? Why don't they also move? Like, why can't the horse, when it's in the spell and trap zone, why does it have a continuous effect to burn your opponent when it could be so much more interactive? Like, if this or that happens, you can move the knight to the monster zone, but not in the same column, right? It has to move like the knight would move in a game of chess, and then it does something, right? That could have been so like interactive, because then like whatever. I think that could have been really, really cool. Instead, it's just a continuous inflict 500 damage. And this one is just like a floodgate. And it's like, okay, well, I mean, I don't really see the chess flavor in that one. They should have made them like the Centurion cards. Yeah, exactly. Like that, right? Like, why not something like this where you make it a deck? Because I think that would have been also really on point with the flavor, is if they made the chess deck really dependent on positioning, right? Like, if, like, for example, you have to make sure that your horse, like, that you can use it to a zone where like the horse could normally move, and then it does something cool if it does that, and you have to make sure that that zone is is open, or like, you know, sometimes even like maybe move it to your opponent's side of the field and then do something like that. I don't know. I think there was a lot of opportunities here, and they chose this or this. And it's like, I feel like we could have done better than that to get the flavor of chess. Well, okay. Here we have Angeliki Enlisted, which is the pawn. And here's another cool thing about the pawn. The pawn is not really supposed to go into your spell trap zone, which makes sense because the pawn, when you make your game of chess, the pawn is not in the back row. The pawn is the front row. So the way the pawn hits the field is usually as a monster, which I also think is really cool. You can target one opponent's monster in this card's adjacent column, banish it, then change control of this card by moving it to one of your opponent's main monster zone in this card's adjacent columns. This, once again, oozing of flavor, because that's the way the pawn takes in a game of chess, is it takes diagonally, right? It takes diagonally. So if there's a monster in this card's adjacent column, which is a fancy way of saying diagonal to it, you can get rid of it, and then the pawn goes there. Because that's how you take in chess. You move, you capture with the pawn and go to that square. And if the control of this face-up card changes, return this card to the extra deck, then you can special an Angeliki monster from the extra deck. You can only use this effect once per turn. This is meant to represent the promotion, right? Like when you go to the other side of the board with a pawn in a game of chess, you can promote it to a different piece. So when you manage to capture a monster with the pawn, it goes back to your extra deck, and you get a different piece out of it. And this is like, this is awesome. I would want more of this kind of thing in this archetype, rather than, you know, here's a floodgate effect, or here's 500 damage, right? Like I would have liked this exact same thing from the other pieces when they are in your spell trap zone. It's like, you know, yeah. So, okay. But this is cool. This is really cool. Angeliki Problem, field spell card. So this is supposed to be your chess board. Once per turn, discard a spell trap, special a level 2 Angeliki monster from your extra deck, and if you do, place an Angeliki monster from your extra deck to your spell trap zone as a face-up continuous spell. If a face-up Angeliki monster card you control is destroyed by battle or card effects, you can return an Angeliki monster card you own from your spell trap zone to the extra deck, then you can special summon it. So, I guess this is something we haven't even talked about it yet, but this is a deck, and this is very interesting from a deck building and competitive perspective as well. This is a deck with no main deck monsters. This is a deck where it's basically all spell traps, and I don't know if this is going to mean you're going to just put it with other engines or whatever, but realistically your main deck for Angeliki is really empty. It's just not a lot of cards in the main deck, which I think kind of like forces it to be an engine right now, because you can't really build a full-on Angeliki deck with 3 main deck cards as of now. Like, well, what are we doing, right? And so it's kind of like made to be an engine, I think, at least from the first wave of support. And even with the second wave, I don't really expect this to change, because the second wave, well, there's just a couple of pieces missing. Like we need the queen and the bishop, so we're probably getting 2 more synchros, and then you know, how much else can they do with the 5 remaining cards? And they're probably not going to make like main deck monsters for it, because what other monster would you really make? Because there's no more chess pieces. But yeah, black pieces as kaijus would be cool. Dude, the thing is, like, the possibilities are technically endless for something like this, and I do think it's a really, really cool thing that they tried to do here. I'm just like a little worried that they are not good enough to see play competitively, which would be fine in my opinion. I think if they weren't good competitively, I could still appreciate what they did with these cards. I just think that at the moment, or the thing that I'm scared of basically, is that at the moment, the way these cards would see play is probably as just like a combo deck with other engines in it, or win by floodgating, which are 2 things that I'm not super fond of. Let's say it like that, right? So yeah. Anyways, the field spell is solid. you know, the field spell is a really solid way to get you going. You do discard a spell trap, and then you get the pawn from your extra deck, and you get an angelic monster from your extra deck to your spell and trap zone, which is usually, I mean, probably gonna be the rook. And then the rook gives you the king for free, and then the king gives you an angelic spell trap from your deck. So you have, from one discard, you get the pawn, you get the rook, and you get the king, which is okay. And then you can go from there. You know, the pawn is a level 2 tuner that you can summon for free. There's no locks here. I do think, in theory, can you send those 2 cards that you place for like Snake Eyes Doomed Dragon, for example? Or does it say, wait, is it spells or traps that you need to send for Doomed Dragon? But I think you can. So in theory, this card is in general a 1-card, it's a 1-card level 10 synchro. Or am I missing a synchro lock somewhere? There's no synchro lock on this card. I think the trap has a synchro lock. Yeah, the trap has a synchro lock, I'm pretty sure. But the field spell itself could just be a 1-card level 10 synchro in any deck, theoretically. Plus a free search of the trap card, right? Because the king. Angelic Disturbance, normal trap, give control of 1 Angelic monster you control to your opponent until the end phase. Then if your opponent controls a face-up card in its adjacent monster zone and or spell trap zone, their effects are negated. Banish this card from your grave, add an Angelic spell trap from your deck to your hand, except Disturbance. You can only use each effect of Disturbance once per turn. This is cool, because once again, it plays into the theme of Angelic cards going over to your opponent's side of the field. And of course, if you give them the pawn, this is going to come back to you, which is kind of cool, which is what you're supposed to do with it. So I think it's neat. It can potentially, if you give them a monster in its adjacent monster zone and or spell trap zone, yeah, you can just negate any spell with this as well, which is really powerful, actually. In testing, the king isn't even the most cringe. It's setting up multiple knights in the back row. I guess the fact that they are spell traps does make them in some ways harder to answer, because with Masquerade, something you could often do was just summon a bigger dude and attack it. And so, like, I mean, if you put 2 or 3 knights, since they do stack, if you put multiple knights into the spell trap zone, it can become really, really difficult to deal with, because you take 1,000 damage or 1,500 damage every time you activate something. Yeah, it could genuinely be that that's the harder thing to answer. So, yeah. And then we have Angelic opening to e4, which is a very controversial card design because it's a turn 0 play. But I think this is one of the reasons why, like, if basically what this card says is if you're playing Angelic as an engine in your deck, you just have an additional hand trap basically in your deck. So this card is completely custom for this deck. If your opponent goes first, you can also activate this card from your hand during the standby phase of their first turn, which is the reason why this card is good. But at the same time, I personally, I think that this is something that they should probably do for more trap cards to make sure that traps are still good in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! In theory, I don't hate this. I think the problem is that what you get on turn 0 is essentially floodgates. But okay. Place an Angelic field spell from your hand, deck, or grave face up on the field. If you do, special a level 2 or 7 Angelic from your extra deck to the extra monster zone. If you do, place an Angelic monster from your extra deck in your spell trap zone as a continuous spell. Until the end of your next turn, you are locked into synchros. So basically what this card does is it gives you, I mean, your opening play of exactly what you would do with Angelic Problem. And then you start the game fully set up, basically. Like, this is something that you would do with Angelic Problem, is like you would discard a spell trap, you would get the field, you have the field spell, you would get the pawn, and you would place one in the spell trap zone. Is the exact same thing that you can do with this card. When I read this card for the first time, I was like, why can you summon the level 7 just now. I was like, why can't we summon the knight with this? Because why would we want to summon the knight with this? Because the knight is supposed to be in the back row. But now on second thought, it's of course because when you're doing an opening to e4 in chess, that can be by moving the pawn, but you can also move the knight, right? But wait, would the knight go to e4? It doesn't reach e4, does it? Hold up. Chessboard. Yeah, the knight can't reach e4 in one move. Okay, I like this card less now. I like this card less now because the knight cannot go to e4. I actually hate it now. I mean, okay, you guys are saying, all right, the pawn and the knight are the only pieces that can you know, move on the first turn in chess. That's true. At the same time, they could have just called it. They could have just called it opening to e3, right? Which is where the pawn can go and where the knight can go. Technically, they could have just called it opening to e3, huh? Or just opening. Anyways, it doesn't really matter. Most of the time, you're just gonna summon the pawn. But who opens to e3, really? Ah, dude, come on. It's because e4 is a more common play. Yeah, I know, but the knight can't go. That, dude, it's not that deep, dude. It's not that deep. It's fine. This card is, of course, incredibly strong, right? Any hand trap, quote unquote, that gets you to a full setup, because you don't even lose card advantage in your hand if you activate this card. Because what you're gonna do is you're gonna summon the pawn, you're gonna place the rook is gonna place the king, and then the king gets you another Angeliki trap. So you still have 5 cards in hand after you do that. Or you could also just place the knight and add an Angeliki spell. If you'd rather have a spell in hand, it would just be another copy of the field spell though. But essentially, you start the game with the field spell, the pawn, and 2 cards in your spell trap zone, which is incredibly strong. And you refill your hand back to 5 cards. And I think that's pretty big. That's pretty big. And it's the reason why I think this deck is actually potentially real. And here's another thing. Here's another small thing about this deck. Because they're all extra deck monsters, in theory, this deck has 0 engine requirements. If you just play a deck that doesn't care about the synchro lock, this is kind of like Harmonia in a way, where you can just play the field spell and the opening to e4 in your deck, and you have like no breaks, quote unquote. You have no engine requirements. You have your field spell, which is the starter going first for those cards, or even going second. You can use it. And if you draw the trap going second, well, that's just a hand trap. And if you draw the trap going first, then you're going to set it and activate it during your opponent's turn. And it's just like, okay, dude, like that's just there's no downsides, essentially. There's essentially no downsides. This is how you bridge to Angeliki combo. Yeah, we've read this card earlier at some point, I believe. If this card is synchro summoned, you can add a level 8 or higher monster with 0 attack from your deck to your hand. You can target a monster with 0 attack in your grave, special summon it, negates effects. Cannot be used as material. You can only use each effect. So what's the idea with this one again? I hate this guy. Gotta read Witness of the Ancient. Oh yeah, that's also a new card. Witness of the Ancient. If you have a synchro monster in your field or grave, special summon this card from your hand. If this card special summon, place up to 3 synchro monsters with different names from your extra deck and or grave in your spell trap zone as face-up continuous spells. Special and arc token. Also for the rest of the turn, you cannot special from the extra deck except synchros. So this just fully sets you up with stuff in your spell trap zone, and this just adds it. So any level 8 synchro, you just summon this, add Witness of the Ancient, special Witness of the Ancient. You get a token. This is a tuner. So you can just place 2 synchros. Like the knight and you can place knight and rook. You're going to get the king for free. And you have a level 2 token. That's and a level 8 tuner. Okay. Yeah, I mean, both of these cards seem incredibly strong for this deck in particular. So you can basically any deck that's just synchro based, like White Albaz, for example, you could just do a lot of this. I mean, White Albaz actually is probably not the best example, because if you're locked into level 8 specifically from the extra deck, it's not great. You would have to normal summon it, because you do want to probably get the field spell and then summon the pawn still and make like level 10 synchros. But I do think, long story short, I do think there's a lot of potential here. I do think there is a lot of potential here. And these cards are basically perfect for synchro slop, which is, in my personal opinion, this is bad news, because I would, in an ideal world, this would have been a good deck on its own and not just spam synchros. Like, I think there should have been a lock to Angelici somewhere here, and then just have them be more interactive rather than this effect or this effect. Because these cards themselves are incredibly passive, right? It's like, you set them up in your spell trap zone, they do nothing interactive except for like placing some continuous restrictions on your opponent, which is kind of meh in that sense. Right? I wish it was more interactive, and I wish it could hold its own as its own deck. But for now, it looks like it's just going to be something that you bridge into with other synchro decks. You just get it for free on top, and you also get to play Angelici opening to e4, which, keep in mind, this makes it soon, you're going to be able to play a lot of exclusive hand traps in synchro decks, right? Like, imagine once we get the overframe for the junk synchro stuff, you can theoretically play 3 exclusive hand traps to synchro decks. You can play Harmonia, you can play the new junk synchron trap, and you can play the Angelici trap, which is basically going to end up with your deck being like packed full of engine, but also has at least 9 hand traps that are really high quality and exclusive to synchro strategies, right? So there's a lot of potential with these cards, and I wouldn't be surprised if they end up being really, really strong. And remember, there's a second wave to come. There's a second wave, 7 more cards that are also gonna, help this deck probably. So there's real potential with Angelici, and I don't think it doesn't strike me as the next Mitsurugi, but it's because it's just very different from that. The reason why it's good is very different than Mitsu. But it could still end up being very popular, just because there's once again a very, very distinct lack of restrictions on these cards is the thing that makes them good, I suppose.